Hello, and welcome to Hard Conversations. This is a podcast about male sexuality, intimacy, and sex positivity, where we unpack the taboo topic of erectile issues in a safe, non-judgmental space. And now, here's your host, sex therapist, Timothy Norton.
Hello, and welcome to Hard Conversations. Christopher Germer, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and lecturer on psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He is a co-developer of the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which has been taught to over 100,000 people around the globe, and author of The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, and co-author of Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion program and the Mindful Self-Compassion workbook. He is also a co-editor of the books Mindfulness and Psychotherapy and Wisdom and Compassion in Psychotherapy. Dr. Germer is a founding faculty member of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, as well as the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion, Cambridge Health Alliance, Harvard Medical School. He teaches and leads workshops internationally on mindfulness and compassion, and has a private practice in Arlington, Massachusetts, specializing in mindfulness and compassion-based psychotherapy. Hello, Chris, and welcome to Hard Conversations.
Thank you, Tim. I'm really happy to be here.
Okay, great. I'm really excited to have you on the show. In the therapy land, we nerd out to certain people in the industry or whatever you want to call it, and you're really popular and self-compassion, at least among my colleagues, at least among Los Angeles therapists. Self-compassion is something that I feel like I'm talking about on a daily basis and trying to teach to a lot of people. And it's a really valuable tool, I'd say. And it's really counterintuitive to a lot of American or Western ideals. And maybe you...
That's well said.
So a lot of clients don't take to it immediately. And especially some of my more perfectionistic, high-achieving, go-get-'em clients. And so I was hoping to just hear it directly from the expert himself. And how do you feel that, or what's the best way for a person to just take that message in, that this is a valuable tool when they grew up in a culture that's more of a, work as hard as you can for 90 hours a week and get ahead and drive yourself until you collapse and you can sleep when you're dead is a common aphorism.
Yeah, so a lot of people actually throughout the whole world have a kind of cringe reaction to the term self-compassion, but just about nobody doesn't like the experience of self-compassion. In the same way, when somebody's being genuinely kind to us in just the right way, we don't usually resist it. We're just grateful, Yeah. And so a general informal definition of self-compassion is giving yourself the same kindness and understanding as you would give to a dear friend in need. So when we're struggling, when we're stressed, when we failed, if we feel inadequate, which we often have little pings of throughout the day, to have a general self-compassionate attitude really allows us to allows us to recover and be more resilient. But there are a few main myths about self-compassion as people understand it. The first myth is that it is like self-pity. And self-pity kind of means, that you're just kind of wrapped up in yourself and you can't see beyond yourself. But the research shows actually that people who are highly self-compassionate, or even just kind of self-compassionate, they ruminate less. They're less self-absorbed, they ruminate less, and they are more able to see their struggles from a healthy perspective than people who are low in self-compassion. So there's a very clear difference between self-pity and self-compassion. What's interesting is there are actually 5 main myths about self-compassion. And we call them myths because the research shows, precisely the opposite. Another big one for men is motivation. you were talking about perfectionism, that it'll kind of make a person feel like they'll lose their edge or something. And what's interesting about self-compassion is that actually people who are high in self-compassion are, their standards are just as high, like they have high standards, just like anyone else, but they're more motivated to achieve those standards. They're actually more able to see and admit when things go wrong, and they're more motivated to correct what might have gone wrong and to work hard toward achieving their goals. So self-compassionate people are not less motivated, they're actually more motivated. But what's interesting is why they're motivated, and that's because we can motivate ourselves with criticism, or we can motivate ourselves with encouragement. So most people on this call might have at some point had somebody who's kind of, they might have had a coach or somebody who feels like a coach or a well-wisher. And, that's a person who motivates us to achieve our best. But they do it with kindness. They do it with understanding. They don't do it by saying, what's the matter with you? You idiot. What made you even think that you could do this kind of thing? Basically, they don't talk to us the way we talk to ourselves typically when things go wrong. So self-compassion is actually a new voice, a new motivating voice, a voice based on encouragement rather than criticism.
Okay. Yeah, I really like how you started that talking about rumination. As we've discussed, and as you're aware, this is a show that generally talks about erectile issues. And there's a tendency for guys to ruminate when they're not getting cooperation from an erection, is how we say it. And they'll really get in their heads and, what did I do wrong? And what does this say about me? And I'm a failure, or I'm a bad husband. I'm not a good man. And so what you're saying is that someone who is going to show more self-compassion toward themselves is going to do that less?
Yes, definitely. and there are other aspects to self-compassion that would surely help when somebody's having erectile difficulties. Another core component of self-compassion is that people feel less isolated and alone. They feel more connected with the rest of humanity. So in other words, a self-compassionate guy might be more likely to say, hey, I'm a guy, this is what happens for men when we're distracted or when we're anxious or whatever it may be, or if it's organic difficulty like post-prostate or something, to be able to say, this unfortunately goes with the territory sometimes. So the idea is when we feel alone, then our suffering increases. When we ruminate, our suffering increases. And when we criticize ourselves, our suffering increases. And what's interesting, Tim, is that those 3 points that I just made are precisely the opposite of the scientific definition of self-compassion. So instead of rumination, we have mindfulness, or kind of spacious awareness. Instead of a sense of isolation, we have a sense of common humanity, or I'm not alone. And instead of self-criticism, we have self-kindness. And the other thing, and I think this goes right to the heart of people struggling with erections, is those 3 experiences of self-criticism, isolation, and rumination are precisely what happens when people feel the emotion of shame. Shame. And if nothing else, self-compassion is an antidote to shame. And there are many interesting ways that works. We could have that conversation as well, but maybe there's something else which we should be discussing beforehand.
No, let's go with that, because shame does come up so much. Like this is, I was reading, this is what you do when you have podcasts about erectile issues. I was reading the history of, we called it impotence until not very long ago. And there were records of, Greeks and Egyptians in their texts worrying about this and writing about this and coming up with herbal remedies for it. Like, this is something that the men have struggled with for a very long time.
Yeah.
So to say that it's a source of shame is historical. And
humans have been dealing with shame since a long time. It's part of the whole Garden of Eden story.
Right.
As soon as we have a sense of a separate self, in other words, there's like me and you, and I'm no longer, at one with everything in the garden. As soon as we have a sense of separate self, then we start to worry, am I okay? But to get to shame in particular, it's really interesting to look at shame through the eyes of self-compassion, because when we do that, we learn a few things. So just let me say, first of all, that shame is a really interesting emotion. It's a social emotion. It means I'm imagining what you are imagining about me, and it's not good. Mm-hmm. That's what shame is. And it also boils down to it's an attack on the self. The difference between guilt and shame is guilt means I did something wrong. Shame means something's wrong with me, And that's what happens when people have erectile dysfunction, I personally have had this, a number of times in my life. And each time I kind of attack myself, like, what's the matter with me? Like the last time it happened, I might have been 55 years old, and it meant to me, oh my God, I'm getting old. I can't perform anymore, and so forth. But what it was a, doubt about myself, but not just doubt about myself. The thought that there is something. This is the cool thing from a compassion point of view. Shame is the fear that there is something about me that will render me unlovable. And every one of us is born with the wish to be loved. When a child is born, the child has two basic requirements. One is to breathe, and the second is to get somebody to love the child, because otherwise the child can't survive. And we go through our whole lives wishing to be loved, and also afraid that there's something wrong with us that's going to render us unlovable. And when a man, particularly would like somebody to love them, in the sexual area and so forth, and it doesn't work, then they think, oh my God, I'm now unlovable, And because sexuality and intimacy and love is so commingled, generally speaking, in our culture. So what self-compassion does, and it's really quite amazing, is that self-compassion gives us a sense of self-worth, first of all, not necessarily from what other people think about us, but rather from our capacity to be kind to ourselves when things go wrong. Self-compassion takes us out of that social approval cycle, which is so pernicious in life, because we can't get everybody to like us, and we're definitely going to, fail. But when things go wrong in our lives, do we have an inner voice that can support us and lift us up, as we would hope our lover would do, or a friend would do, when we find that things aren't working the way we want them to? So self-compassion takes us out of that spectatoring thing and makes us feel good about ourselves through sheer inner kindness. So that's the foundation of it. This is why self-compassion is a wonderful antidote to shame. And one last thing is that when people have erectile issues, it is also in the general category of social anxiety, but more specifically performance anxiety. And performance anxiety has this kind of vicious cycle. Like, you worry about it, and then you worry about worrying, and it goes. So how do you break that cycle? How do you get out of, you might say, a cycle of fear? And the way to do that is to change your physiology from a fear state to a care state. And that's precisely what self-compassion is. Self-compassion moves us out of fear and into care by doing the thing which ultimately we need the most, which is to care for ourselves.
All right. I think if people could just take in that last 5-minute segment, that really sums it up. That really, I feel, I really appreciate your words there. So let's delve into a little bit of it. Let's start with this inner voice. So guy comes in, third session, and he hears your podcast, and he says something along the lines of course I've been rendered unlovable. My penis doesn't work. I have so much shame. Can you respond to that, or teach some of the phrases or the lexicon of that inner voice and what he could start saying to himself?
Yes. Thank you. That's excellent. So, as I mentioned, the 3 components of self-compassion, particularly as articulated by Kristen Neff, who started all the research on this in 2003, are number 1, mindfulness. And that means to know what we're feeling while we're feeling it, especially to be able to say, this is painful, rather than ruminating and getting into how I'm going to fix this and how I suck as a human being or as a man or whatever. To be able to simply say, ouch, this is painful. I was really looking forward to this night and it didn't work. This hurts. That's part 1. Part 2 is, and it's part of being a man. It doesn't always work when you're a guy. Women can kind of fake it. Guys have a harder time faking it. So to say, and this is part of being a man, sometimes it just doesn't work, and I'm not alone. This is part of the experience, and in particular, when I'm anxious or whatever, it's even less likely to work. So that's part 2, which is common humanity. So number 1, oh, this is a bummer. Number 2, you know what? I'm not the only person that this happened to. And when we really internalize that, we can even say to our lover, it didn't work this time, but, let's give it a go again a little bit later. Let's see, maybe it'll work next time. And even if it doesn't work next time, you're still a man. This is still normal, and eventually it'll probably work again. Depends on your situation, But this is tough. It's part of being a man. And then part 3 is actually to have an inner voice that we can talk to ourselves. And this is the cool thing, Tim, to ask ourselves, what would I say to a dear friend right now who just called me up or said, I'd like to have a cup of coffee with you because I got to tell you what happened to me last night. I feel so ashamed. If a friend called us up or asked to see us, and we had just like a minute or 2 to spend with that person, and heart to heart, say something to that person, what would we say to a dear friend who just experienced the same frustration? And whatever those words are, and they could be words like, dude, you're a good man, this kind of thing happens to us, and besides, you think that so-and-so is not going to love you because of this. Well, you know what? If you look at the history, you're the best thing that's ever happened to her, or, any kind of conversation, but mostly to connect with the wounded heart of the friend. And then to turn to oneself and, just to say, as you might say to a friend, I love you, man. I know you're going to get through this. This is temporary. I've been through this too. To say that to yourself. Imagine you can say to yourself, didn't work this time. Part of being man. I love you anyway. You're a great guy. This isn't the end of the world. Your body knows what to do. It's done this before. Just give it a chance. We can do this. But for now, let's just let it rest. Some kind of internal conversation that is fundamentally compassionate and supportive rather than the usual.
Very well said. It's what That process, though, that switching from being there for a friend to then turning it back towards yourself, I find so many people struggle with that. Like and I liked how in the beginning you said, this is how you would behave with a dear friend. I hear a lot of people say this is how they would treat a stranger, or they'd be so much kinder to a waiter or someone, a bus driver. And so why is it so hard for people to be kind to themselves?
Anyhow, you're making a really great point, Tim, because we also find we're not particularly kind to our family or to our children. So the key is actually perspective. In other words, actually the Dalai Lama once said it's really easy to be compassionate toward others because they're not you. What it means is that when we're really close to ourselves and we're really close to our, family or our children or something, and when we're really close, we just react. We don't have the space to remain calm and to be kind. So that's perspective. But we can also make perspective. And this is why mindfulness is the foundation of self-compassion practice, because mindfulness is spacious awareness. Mindfulness is, like I said before, knowing what you're experiencing while you're experiencing it. If we can step back and say, this really hurts, and actually feel in our body, that maybe our heart's beating, or maybe we feel heartbroken in that moment. If we can actually feel that in the moment, our sense of self separates a little bit from it, and we get perspective. And in that space, we can say to ourselves, and I'm not alone, this is part of being a man, and we can be kind to ourselves. We have the possibility of new non-automatic language when we have a mindful space, when we are mindfully aware of what's been going. Yeah.
So for the listeners, what might that moment look like? So the guy, let's say it's the next day, he's on the way to work, he's sitting in traffic, listening to this podcast, and he had a rough night, and then the erectile issues wasn't working, and he's beating himself up. And so now he's like, all right, what were the things I had to do again? I had to be mindful. And so what does that actually mean?
Well, it usually means what I had described, which means that just the kind of the courage to feel sad about it. And when we do that, we're actually not caving. We're actually not going to, it's not going to increase the likelihood that the same thing happens again. It's going to decrease the likelihood it happens when we can say, yeah, I feel really frustrated and sad about this. This kind of breaks my heart. This was a hot date, and it was like such a hot date that I was like all, turned inside out around it, and it didn't work. Oh, this is really disappointing to me. So that's actually, Tim, kind of the main thing. But let me say something else. There is a quintessential self-compassion question. And the question is, what do I need? What do I need? And when our heart is broken because, we've suffered, we failed, we feel inadequate in some way, when our heart is broken, then we can ask ourselves, what do I need? And there are a few, usually we're not able to answer that precisely. So we can ask sort of more specific questions like, right now, what do I need to feel safe again? What do I need to feel safe? So maybe I need to hear from my lover that, I'm still loved. Or maybe can you think of some other things that a guy might need to feel safe, Tim?
He might need to feel like she's not going to leave him. That there's not something physiologically wrong with him. What you're talking about earlier, feelings of self-worth.
Mm-hmm. So those things, maybe somebody needs to remind you you're a good person. Maybe you need to go to the doctor if that'll keep you from obsessing. Maybe you need to check with your partner. Hey, this is not a big deal for me. Maybe you need to hear that,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's safety. But there are other things. What do I need? What do I need to comfort myself? Okay, so I'm like all a dither. Maybe I need to hang out with a friend and share it with a friend. What do I need to soothe myself physically? Say if I'm, all kind of tense about this, maybe I need to go for a run. Maybe I need to swim. Maybe I need to lift weights. Maybe, whatever it may be. What do I need to comfort myself, soothe myself? Also, what do I need to validate myself? That means, what do I really need to know that maybe I don't know now that, is true for me?
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things might be, dude, this has actually happened to you before. It wasn't a deal breaker in that relationship. Why would it be in this? And besides, if it is, do you really want to be with this person, kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
So comforting, soothing, validating. But then there are also, so that's what we call the yin side of things, the being with part. But compassion also has a yang side or an action side. And that is, what do I need to protect myself? Okay. So for example, it's possible that this person, that a person with erectile issues was actually trying to be intimate with somebody who scared him. Maybe it was actually a bad relationship, or maybe, he's in a relationship and this other thing will really wreck his life. And there's a part of him that's just freaked out about it and it doesn't work. So then to protect myself would mean not to do this. Maybe my body is smarter than my head and is just saying, I'm not going to go there, So that's protecting. Or providing. Providing for ourselves means, maybe I was trying to make love in the morning and I'm really sleepy in the morning and, Henry just didn't wake up, or maybe in the evening, or maybe I drank too much or something, So provide for ourselves means to attend to what it is that we need in order to be relaxed and happy in a sexual context, That's providing. And then motivating. Motivating, as I said, is motivating with encouragement rather than criticism. And so surely after it doesn't work, I know this personally because, as I said, it's happened to me. I'm also a guy. Most of the thoughts in my head are compulsive, oh, what you need to do as quickly as possible, try it again, before it gets in your head and blah, blah, blah. And, but that's kind of a tense voice, it's kind of a, Chris, get back on the horse and ride as fast as possible or you're screwed,
Mm-hmm.
So what would it be to have a kind, compassionate voice that says, whoa, dude, let's just settle down a minute. Let's just ask ourselves, a few, fundamental questions like, do you really believe that for all men all the time it works? You know what? Why don't you just make sure the next time that you're in the right place and frankly that you trust this person a little more, that you're feeling happier in your own skin and so forth. In other words, you can do this. You have done this before. It will happen again. I know, but let's just take a look at it and figure out how to make it work for you. So this is motivating ourselves with encouragement rather than, compulsive and ruminative and self-critical. So these are answering the question, what do I need? This is a really important question to ask after a moment of, quote unquote, failure. And frankly, I think often when people have erectile issues, it's not failure, it's body wisdom. And it's giving us an opportunity to learn something.
Yeah. No, that's, again, really excellent points. I want to go back to, you named a couple of emotions. You talked about fear, and you talked about, you said this hurts, right? And I find that a lot of guys, as simple as those sound, really struggle to identify that in themselves. And that point about mindfulness, I always try to guide people mindfully toward recognizing those emotions, because a lot of guys out there want to have this idea of themselves that nothing can hurt them, and they don't really need to be afraid of anything.
Yeah.
Invulnerable, right. And so, again, he's driving to work and had a bad night. That mindful moment of fear and hurt, I think gets skipped over a lot. So, and straight to the action, straight to the okay, now how do I fix this?
How do I fix this? Right. That's like the traditional male imperative,
Right.
I fix stuff. But we can't fix everything.
No, we can't.
Especially when it comes to the body. The body has a wisdom of its own.
Right.
It will not take orders. When they're barked out, it will not take orders that are being barked out to us. It will take orders from the inside when there's a sense of safety and comfort and happiness.
Totally. So I'm wondering if you have come across this and just ever broken it down to its nuts and bolts of how do I even recognize fear in myself? Like, I've never been afraid of anything.
Yeah. So how do I recognize fear? I think this is really key in the area of erectile issues, because it's not helpful to be afraid, but also it's especially not helpful to be afraid of being afraid.
Right.
So what we want to do is to just be able to hold number one, that I'm afraid, number two, that I'm afraid of being afraid, but then actually change the channel by being kind to ourselves, But in answer to the question, like, how do I know when I'm afraid? I think this is really close to a lot of the kind of traditional ways of working with erectile issues, which is to help people to get in tune with their bodies, to know when they're afraid. And so we can feel fear in various ways. We can feel, for example, if our fingertips are moist or cool. We can sense when our thoughts are racing, when we're kind of spectatoring rather than in our bodies, the engaged in the actions that we're doing. Our hearts could race, our blood pressure can go up, we can get headaches, I was once really, really nervous on a date, and I got like a splitting headache, and I almost vomited at dinner. And needless to say, that particular evening didn't go well from a erectile point of view, because I was in a state of, extreme stress.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so I think it's just really helpful to know that fear in general, we need to know fear when it's happening, but we also don't want to get afraid of fear, because that's called panic. And that is also part of, the cycle that can occur. But the cycle is not a problem in and of itself. What it is an opportunity. It is an invitation to change the channel. It's an invitation. And this is, I think, if anything, if I can share any message about self-compassion on your podcast, Tim, the most essential message, I think, is that what we're doing with self-compassion is being kind to ourselves simply because it's not working. In other words, I'm afraid, so sue me. I'm afraid of being afraid, so sue me. This is called human physiology. And can we, in this whole conundrum, in this kind of whole fix. Can we be kind to ourselves simply because this is so? And what people usually do, at least initially, Tim, when they learn self-compassion, is they think, oh, cool, I have a new strategy. I'm going to really, I'm going to knock this problem out with this slick new strategy called self-compassion. And so then they think they can throw self-compassion at the anxiety or at the fear of fear or at, their penis or something, and it just doesn't work. So we have a saying, and this is the most essential thing, Tim, and that is, when we suffer, we practice self-compassion not to make things better, but simply because we feel bad. Simply because we feel bad. So can I love myself? Can I be kind to myself? Can I be supportive of myself because my penis isn't working? Can I just be kind to myself because this situation really sucks and I feel miserable and I have so much self-doubt and I have so much worry and my heart is broken and I can't imagine how this is ever going to work? Can we love ourselves because of that? Can we be kind to ourselves and supportive of ourselves and be a good coach to ourselves because of that? Rather than using self-compassion to manipulate ourselves into some other new physiological condition that we think is going to make it all go better. This is absolutely essential.
Thank you so much. There's a real advocacy coming from you. That's you're obviously very passionate about your work, but it sounds like you're helping people stand up for themselves.
Yes, indeed, and for their humanity. We're not standing up for some crazy image of what it means to be a man. We're standing up to we're standing up for the man that I am. In other words, masculinity is not something out there. It's the way I am. If you want to know what masculinity is, you get 20 male identified people in the room and that's it. So we're not comparing ourselves to some crazy notion of what it means to be a man. We're actually giving ourselves permission to be more fully human. This is ultimately what makes the mind work, makes the body work, and brings our life satisfaction. And it's a good thing that the penis doesn't always work, because often it shouldn't work. and so if we kind of try to make things happen, we got to trust the body, we got to trust our humanity, we got to trust our minds, and we got to love ourselves when things don't work, and then we can live happily and truly human.
There's so much there. Let's start with, so when you're helping somebody stand up for themselves, I'm thinking about the guy in this situation and who or what he's standing up to, and all the messages from, both at the macro level and in the bedroom. The messages from porn, the messages from the media, the messages in movies. But then the message from the partner, which sometimes is also not compassionate. Maybe you alluded to that earlier. Sometimes it's really hard to be kind to the people closest to us. And so how does that go when
we have a partner who's not understanding?
Yeah.
So first of all, it's important to kind of take a look at that. One point is that often one's partner feels the same shame, like what's the matter with me? I'm not attractive enough. I'm not, sexy enough. My technique isn't right. I have failed you. What's the matter with me? So then we have two people in two corners of the bedroom, both like engulfed in shame. So, if one person, when we're in shame, we actually can't see beyond ourselves. So one of those two people needs to get out of their shame and actually be able to be self-compassionate, which means to say, didn't work for us tonight, did it? It's kind of disappointing. I guess that's part of all relationships, and even starting relationships, and maybe find a way of being kind to each other. That's like fundamentally self-compassionate. But it is possible sometimes that that the other person just doesn't have it in them to be compassionate when things don't work for a guy. And that is a take-home message that you really want to get, because you don't want to be with somebody who's like that. You don't want to be with somebody who's going to react to your frustration with attacking. It is so the message is, like, that's a message from God. Get it in your head and find somebody who's kinder. Mm-hmm. When you think about, like, what is a really good partner or person we like to spend time with, it's a kind heart, I mean, we like sexiness, we like brains, we like, health, we like money, we like, anything. We like so many external things, but at the end of the day, when we lay our head down on the pillow, what does it feel like to be with somebody else? Does your heart rest? And can your heart rest if you're with a person who is not kind? And the answer is no. So if we have a partner who's harsh and critical, if a man in my view, has a partner who's harsh and critical when things don't work for him, that is an important message to take home.
Because he's presumably going to be in that fear state, or there's always a criticism around the corner, and it taps into the fear you mentioned earlier that he won't be loved.
Yes, and if the woman or the man, whoever the partner is, doesn't allow us to be human, then it's not going to go well, because we are human.
Mm-hmm. No, very well said. And so if this is happening on your fourth or fifth date, it's one thing. Yeah, okay, let's move on to the next person and find a compassionate person. But let's say these issues start to happen 10, 15 years into a marriage. You're not going to just leave. But is that when, how do you deal with that? Like, you're teaching yourself this level of self-compassion. Now, what about teaching a partner how to be compassionate toward you?
That's not worth trying.
Oh, no.
You don't want, Jack Kornfield used to say, it's better to be a Buddha than a Buddhist. You don't really want to have any kind of missionary zeal about, other people. If we find that self-compassion is really good for us, then the best way to teach somebody self-compassion is to be compassionate toward them. And maybe they will. So in other words, to embody self-compassion and to relate in a compassionate way. And that combination is pretty persuasive to just about anybody. But the idea of, like, I think my partner should practice, self-compassion meditation, or they should stop criticizing themselves and they should start doing this, and therefore they should listen to Chris Germer's or Kristen Neff's website, and da-da-da. That's just really annoying, So, if you have buy-in that, and people can see actually that self-compassion is not more work. It's actually less work. Self-compassion is not a struggle. It's a relief. It's a relief. Any moment of self-compassion is a relief. And when our partners can see the transformation in us because we are being more compassionate with ourselves, they're going to want some of that, But if we think, this person is, hurting themselves or hurting me, and they need a little more self-compassion, we're just adding insult to injury, and I really recommend people don't do it. All the energy that we would invest in somebody else changing to become more self-compassionate, we should just do a little U-turn and invest that energy in ourselves so that we more fully and deeply live self-compassionately, which means live a more mindful life, a more self-aware life, a kinder life, and also a life that's less separate or lonely, a sense of more connectedness.
Really like how you state that. It is lead by example, right? And
yeah, that's it.
Hopefully,
you got to lead by example. And as a therapist, it's a little different. As a therapist, you might say, whoa, self-compassion is a really core factor in emotional well-being. It is across the board consistently associated with psychological well-being and with reductions in anxiety, stress, depression, perfectionism, shame, all things like this. It is a remarkable, powerful human resource. And when we learn self-compassion, it's very efficient because it affects so many aspects of our psychological and physical functioning, even improved immune system function. So it's a really good thing to learn. So as a therapist, if somebody comes in with anxiety or depression, or they're self-harming, or they are really defensive in relationship, and you want them just to chill out a little bit, and you think, wow, that person could use some self-compassion. Usually when we say, okay, well, what you really need to do is learn a little self-compassion, they come in feeling anxious or depressed, and they walk out anxious, depressed, and deficient in self-compassion. So that's when we have this idea, like as a therapist, we really need to back up a little bit. And we need to say, okay, what I'm going to do is to really connect with this person. I'm going to feel this person in my own direct experience. I'm going to make sure that this person knows that I know how they feel. I'm going to offer this person kindness and also my highest wisdom, and explore the options. And inevitably, the person will reveal that they actually do want to be more self-compassionate. But my recommendation to counselors is see if you can teach self-compassion without ever mentioning the term, which means, can you be mindful with a person? And this also goes for like in couples, can you be mindful with your partner or with your client? Can you feel your partner or your client as yourself? In other words, a sense of common humanity and emotional resonance. And can you speak compassionately? Can you be compassionate with this person as you might with a dear friend? And when we do that, they get the message, they'll want what you have, and and it's so much easier. It's not a struggle.
Yeah. Really, really valuable advice. Thank you. You were mentioning briefly at the beginning of that, you said that self-compassion is a great indicator across the board of, lowered anxiety and a couple of different things. Is there research on this? Is that what you were alluding to? Have there been studies on self-compassion?
Yeah, sure thing. So Krista Neff started the field really in 2003 when she published her scale, the self-compassion scale. Mm-hmm. And now, at the end of 2019, there are about 2,000 articles in the peer-reviewed academic literature which have the word self-compassion in the title. Probably another 1,000 articles that are about self-compassion, and across the board, we find that self-compassion is actually there's a psychologist at Duke University, Mark Leary, who says that the research is boring because self-compassion is associated with just about every measure of emotional well-being that we have. So, for example, life satisfaction, happiness, gratitude, self-confidence, optimism, wisdom, curiosity, conscientiousness, creativity, autonomy, relatedness, hope, emotional intelligence, perspective taking. And it's also associated with reductions, as I mentioned, of anxiety across the board, Tim, across the board. Just about always when you increase self-compassion, you have a decrease in anxiety, decrease in depression, decrease in stress, and also research decreases in perfectionism, self-criticism, rumination, and so forth. And it's also good for the body, enhanced immune system, fewer self-reported health symptoms, and people treat themselves better. When they're self-compassionate, they eat more balanced meals, they exercise more regularly, they drink less alcohol, they get enough sleep. And also in clinical conditions, we find that increases in self-compassion are kind of a common factor when psychotherapy works, for example. But one thing is important to know is that there are many ways to learn self-compassion. For example, if you own a dog, if you get a dog, you're more likely to become self-compassionate. People who practice yoga, more likely to become self-compassionate. As I said, just going to therapy, if it's a successful therapy, you will probably become more self-compassionate. If you increase your compassion to others, you're more likely to become self-compassionate. If you practice mindfulness, you're likely to become more self-compassionate. So there are many pathways, many ways. The program that Krista Neff and I developed is probably the most well-known one. It's been taught to about 100,000 people around the world by over 2,000 teachers. And it's sort of carefully scaffolded per 8-week, 2.5 hour per session training program. And so that's one way of learning self-compassion in sort of a structured way, but you don't need to do it that way. There are all these other ways that can be done.
Yeah. Right. I always like the non-therapy options for people, dogs and yoga and a mindfulness practice and things like that. Because of course we can learn these skills from other places, and a lucky few of us grow up with it, but not that many.
Yeah, and even when we have had really blessed childhood with what we call secure attachment and so forth, we're still hardwired, Tim, to criticize ourselves when things go wrong. It's actually part of the physiology of the threat state. When the threat is internal, we attack ourselves, we ruminate, we isolate ourselves. Just as we would when we're threatened from the outside, we might attack somebody else or try to get away, or freeze. So I think it's part of human physiology, no matter how blessed our childhood may have been. So all of us really could stand a little self-compassion. It's a practice. We'll never be, as long as we have a human body, we will never be like really great at it. But every moment that we're practicing self-compassion, it's a relief.
And that's a really good point to take in, I think, because the perfectionist is going to be bummed that they're not great at self-compassion, but we're saying you're hardwired for it. So it's going to happen. You are going to be hard on yourself. So
but
buy yourself a little.
There's also the paradox, Tim, which is when we beat up on ourselves for not being great at self-compassion, we then can be kind to ourselves because we're beating up on ourselves because we're not great at self-compassion. And in that act of kindness, we are in fact self-compassionate. So the cool thing about this is you can be self-compassionate in the present moment with anything. And frankly, even just the wish to be kind to ourselves. For example, say somebody has frustrating experience with an erection. They may not be like, a 10 on 1 to 10 in terms of how self-compassionate they are, but they can have the wish to be compassionate with themselves when things don't work out. And that itself is compassionate.
Mm.
It's actually very easy, especially in the beginning. We just formulate the wish.
Mm. Another excellent point. Well, it's been close to an hour. Are there was there anything that you wanted to add to this general conversation about erectile issues and self-compassion? I mean, you've made some really amazing points and takeaways and bullet points and things that
I think we really covered it all, actually way more than I expected. But this key point of when things don't go right for us, we practice not as a kind of a manipulation to fix it, but rather out of simple kindness because things didn't go wrong. The metaphor, Tim, is if you have a child that has the flu and it's a 5-day flu, you're really nice to the child on day 1 and day 2, not to drive the flu away, but because your heart goes out to the child. And so similarly, if things don't work when having sex or something, this is not ultimately a problem which needs to be fixed. It is a disappointment which requires compassion. We can just be kind to ourselves because it didn't work. And the amazing thing is that when we do that, our nervous system shifts from a threat state to a care state, and lo and behold, things are very likely to just take a normal evolution for the better. But again, we're not doing this to make it have a normal evolution for the better. We're just loving ourselves when things go wrong. And we know how to do this.
Out of principle.
Just out of principle. Just like you would love a child who's struggling, we can love ourselves. And when we do it, the body says, thank you. And we'll start to cooperate.
All right, Chris. Well, thank you so much. What do you have on tap for you? You're a very busy guy. You've got a lot going on. What's the future of Chris Germer these days?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, so I spend most of my time supporting teachers of the Mindful Self-Compassion Training Program and so forth. But I'm currently writing a book for Guilford Press on shame through the eyes of compassion. It's a whole new, you might say, approach to shame, a positive approach to shame. And so I'm doing that. And I spend a lot of my time kind of supporting people who are making adaptations of self-compassion training. And so, for example, I think it would be really amazing if somebody would adapt, the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, even a shorter version for erectile issues.
Oh,
I mean,
that's a great idea.
In my view, this would go right to the heart of the matter because it's a performance issue when there aren't organic causes. But even if there are organic causes, for goodness sakes, that's when we need a lot of compassion as well. This is
totally.
But my sense is that it would really get to the heart of the matter with erectile issues. And this is why, Tim, I was so delighted that you invited me to do this, because it seems to me that when shame is involved, when erectile issues are either functional or organic, it is and a sense of self is then under assault. This is precisely the ground that self-compassion gets a lot of traction with.
Well, then you will be hearing from me about that. Let's talk more about how to make that happen. Absolutely. That's a great idea. And I can't wait for your book on shame. Of all the people out there, I want to be writing about shame. That's going to be a very welcome addition to literature and very needed. So thanks again, Chris.
Thank you, Tim.
This is a great talk, and keep doing what you're doing. Your work is really important.
And I'm so honored to be able to speak, and I'm delighted that you're doing this work. I wish when I had some of these difficulties there was the internet and I could have listened to your podcast. That would have been such a relief.
Oh, man. Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks to the show's executive producer, Robin Morrison. Thanks to Kat Murphy, director of social media. Thanks to Team Scrub for the music. Thanks to the sound engineer, Ravi Carmen. Thanks to Brian Hui for naming the show. Thanks to Alex Pitts for the intro. Thanks to Arlene Asuncion for the logo. You can find this podcast at hardconversationspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. You can locate me on Twitter at TimNortonLCSW or on my website for my private practice, timnortontherapy.com. You can also email us at hardconversationspodcast@gmail.com or call into our hotline at 662-626-4276. That's 662-MAN-HARD. Thanks to all my friends and family for brainstorming this show with me. Shout outs to the sex positive community, including sex educators, sex therapists, sex coaches, other fellow sex podcasters, sex surrogates, academics, the sexual health medical community, sex workers, the tantric community, and everybody else involved with having hard conversations. Bye-bye.